Your Majesty, the King, Prime Minister, Professor Kishore Mahbubani, guests from near and far gathered here this evening, may I, on behalf of the Royal Institute for Governance and Strategic Studies, the participants of the 3rd Senior Executive Leadership Program, and the inaugural Military Leaders Strategic Studies Seminar, welcome you to the 6th Friday Forum here at RIGS. We have today, at this most august of gathering, in this auspicious Hall of Wisdom, the Prajna Auditorium, a most distinguished speaker recently selected as one of the world's top 50 thinkers, Professor Kishore Mahbubani, who will be talking on the topic, Asia in Today's World. A student of philosophy and history, Professor Mahbubani has had an illustrious career in government and continues to enthrall and inspire the world with his writings on public issues. With the Singapore Foreign Service from 1971 to 2004, he was posted in Cambodia, where he served during the war in 1973-74, Malaysia, Washington, D.C., and New York, where he served 2 stints as Singapore's ambassador to the UN and as president of the UN Security Council in January 2001 and May 2002. He was permanent secretary at the Foreign Ministry from 1993 to 1998. Currently, Professor is the Dean and Professor in the Practice of Public Policy at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy of the National University of Singapore. Concurrently, Professor Mahbubani continues to serve on boards and councils of several institutions in Singapore, Europe, and North America, including the Yale President's Council on International Activities, Association of Professional Schools of International Affairs, Indian Prime Minister's Global Advisory Council, University of Bocconi International Advisory Committee, World Economic Forum, Global Agenda Council on China, and as chairman of the Lee Kuan Yew World City Prize Nominating Committee. In the world of ideas, Professor Mahbubani has spoken and published globally. His articles have appeared in a wide range of journals and newspapers, including Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Washington Quarterly, Survival, American Interest, National Interest, Time, Newsweek, Financial Times, and New York Times. He has also been profiled in The Economist and in Time magazine. He is the author of Can Asians Think?, published and translated in Singapore, Canada, US, Mexico, India, China, Myanmar, Turkey, and Malaysia. Beyond the Age of Innocence, Rebuilding Trust Between America and the World, published and translated in the US and China. And The New Asian Hemisphere, The Irresistible Shift of Global Power to the East, published and translated in the US, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Egypt, China, Korea, Japan, Indonesia, Italy, Taiwan, and Vietnam. His latest book is The Great Convergence, Asia, the West, and the Logic of One World, published and translated in the US, the Netherlands, and China. It was selected by the Financial Times as one of the best books of 2013. Professor Mahbubani was awarded the President's Scholarship in 1967 and graduated with a first-class honors degree in philosophy from the University of Singapore in 1971. From Dalhousie University, Canada, he received a master's degree in philosophy in 1976 and an honorary doctorate in 1995. He spent a year as a fellow at the Center for International Affairs at Harvard University from 1991 to 1992. He was conferred the Public Administration Medal Gold by the Singapore government in 1998. The Foreign Policy Association Medal was awarded to him in New York in June 2004 with the following opening words in the citation: "A gifted diplomat, a student of history and philosophy, a provocative writer, and an intuitive thinker." Professor Mahbubani was also listed as one of the top 100 public intellectuals in the world by Foreign Policy and Prospect magazines in September 2005 and included in the March 2009 Financial Times list of top 50 individuals, which also included Obama, Wen Jiabao, and Sarkozy, who would shape the debate on the future of capitalism. Professor Mahbubani was selected as one of foreign policy's top global thinkers in 2010 and 2011. In 2011, he was described as the muse of the Asian century. Most recently, he was selected by Prospect magazine as one of the top 50 world thinkers for 2014. This is but a very brief highlight of Professor Mahbubani's extraordinary life, his achievements and contributions. I have kept it brief because, Professor, your illustrious reputation, and as we say in our part of the world, your name and fame has long preceded you here in Bhutan, and this Friday Forum is actually a much-awaited event. We are all eager to listen to your thoughts on Asia in today's world, and without further ado, I would like to invite you to the podium, Professor.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. Your Majesty, Mr. Prime Minister, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure and honor for me to be here in Bhutan. It's a country that I've adored and admired for a long time. My wife is here, our children and I came here for a wonderful holiday here about a decade ago, and we have very warm memories of our time in Bhutan. So I'm very happy to be back here and to be addressing all of you at a sister school of my school, the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Now, I do give speeches regularly, so I find that the hardest thing to decide is how do you start? You know, in America, you begin with a joke. In Asia, you begin with an apology. So what I do is I combine the two traditions, and I apologize for my bad joke. But my bad joke was told by the first Chief Minister of Singapore. His name was David Marshall. It's interesting, Singapore, which is a majority Chinese state, started off with a chief minister who was of Iraqi Jewish origin, and a good friend of mine too. So David Marshall told the story of a young priest, a Catholic priest, who was very devout, who liked to pray, but at the same time he also liked to smoke occasionally, frequently. So one day in desperation he went to the bishop. He said, "Your Grace, please, may I have your permission to smoke while I pray?" And the bishop was, of course, very upset and threw him out. Said, No, this is sacrilegious, you can't do it. So the priest walked out looking very dejected, unhappy. Then he met a fellow priest who said, "What happened?" He explained what happened. The fellow priest thought for a while and he said, wait, I think there's a misunderstanding here. So the fellow priest took the young priest back to the bishop and said, "Your Grace, there's been a misunderstanding here. All that this young man is asking for is permission to pray while he smokes." So, of course, the bishop said, "How can I deny a man permission to pray?" Right? Now, but there's a reason why I begin with that story. Because, you know, it captures brilliantly the fact that you can have the same set of facts. The facts don't change, but the story changes. So, this is the world that we live in today. There is one set of facts and there are two stories about our world. The dominant story, the dominant narrative, is what I call the Western narrative. And now there's an emerging Asian narrative. And since Bhutan and Singapore are in Asia, we have to understand this emerging Asian narrative, because we are entering a completely new era of world history today. So in my remarks today, I will divide my remarks into 3 parts. Chawang can confirm I only make 3 points at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. From the first part, I'll try to describe the nature of this new historical era and how and why it has emerged. In the second part, I will deal with the challenges that we still face in Asia. And then finally, I'll conclude with my forecast for the future and how I see the development of Asia in the coming decade or so. And after that, I hope that I will get some questions from all of you. I always tell everyone that the more difficult the question, the easier it is for me to answer. So please think of the most difficult questions you can think of. You will help me a lot when it comes to the Q&A session. So let me begin the story. And this is the story about the new era of world history we are in. And how would I characterize the new era of world history? With 2 points. Firstly, we are now reaching the end of the era of Western domination of world history. Now, I hasten to add that the end of the era of Western domination of world history is not the end of the West. In fact, the West will remain a strong civilization, and all of us want to see the West remain a strong civilization because the world needs a strong West still. But the capacity of the West to dominate the world is over. Because, and this is my second point, you're seeing the return of Asia. And why do I call it the return of Asia and not the rise of Asia? Because from the year 1 to the year 1820, for 1800 out of the last 2,000 years, the 2 largest economies of the world were always those of China and India. And it's only in the last 200 years that Europe took off and North America took off. So if you view the past 200 years of world history against the backdrop of the past 2,000 years of world history, the past 200 years of world history have been a major historical aberration. So, as you know, all aberrations come to a natural end, and therefore it is perfectly natural for China and India and the other Asian countries to emerge as the largest economies in the world. But I can tell you that this is happening faster than anyone anticipated. And you want to know how fast it is? Let me give you one statistic. In 1980, 34 years ago, according to IMF statistics, in purchasing power parity terms, in PPP terms, the United States share of the global GNP was 25%, and China's share was 2.2%. So in 1980, China's share of the global GNP was less than 10% of that of the United States of America. But amazingly, and this is why we live in amazing times, by the end of this year, 2014, according to IMF statistics, in PPP terms, China's GNP will become larger than that of the United States of America. And by 2030, according to Justin Lin, a former chief economist of the World Bank, China's GNP could become twice the size of the United States in PPP terms. Now, this is an amazing transformation of world history, and we are actually living through some of the most exciting times of human history ever. Because these kinds of transformations rarely occur. But of course, the big question is, why is it happening now? Right? China always had large amount of people. Why did China go down? And why has it come back? And why are all the other Asian countries all coming back at this point in time? So this is why, to answer the question, I came up with a theory that the reason why the Asian countries have finally begun to do well is that they have understood, absorbed, and they are implementing 7 pillars of Western wisdom. And it's by implementing these 7 pillars of Western wisdom, the Asian countries are doing very well now. And I'm going to share these 7 pillars with you. I can't go through all of them at length because I normally give a 1-hour lecture on the 7 pillars. I know I'm supposed to finish in 45 minutes to give you time for Q&A. I'll give you a flavor of these 7 pillars. And it's also important, I believe, to share these 7 pillars because these 7 pillars help Singapore to succeed. And indeed, when students come to our school, I share them also, these pillars, because we want others to also implement these 7 pillars. So I share them widely. And what is the first pillar of Western wisdom? Well, I describe it as free market economics. And if you want proof of the power of free market economics, the largest human laboratory in the world that has tried it out is China. Because as you know, from 1949 to 1979, China tried centrally planned, Soviet-style, state-run economics and went nowhere. And then Deng Xiaoping came along in 1979, smashed Mao Zedong's iron rice bowl, and implemented the 4 modernizations, and China has delivered the fastest growing economy in the world for over 30 years. That's an amazing achievement, and it shows how powerful free market economics is as a mechanism for transforming society, for uplifting people. And China has lifted more people out of absolute poverty than any other country has in human history. It has uplifted 800 million people from absolute poverty. Now, having said that, the remarkable thing that has happened in the last few years is that even though free market economics is a Western concept, a Western gift to humanity, something amazing has happened in the last few years, especially after the global financial crisis of 2008-2009, that the Western societies are beginning to lose faith in free market economics, while the Asian societies have greater and greater faith in free market economics. And if you want empirical proof of this, it's very easy to demonstrate. Because if you believe in free market economics, you believe in free trade, and you believe in free trade agreements. So the word FTA is a nice sounding word if you believe in free trade agreements. But you know, take United States of America, which used to be the leader of free trade for so long. Today the word FTA has become so toxic in America that when the United States negotiates a transatlantic free trade agreement with EU, as it is doing so now, it doesn't call it a transatlantic free trade agreement, TAFTA, because it sounds like NAFTA, and NAFTA is politically toxic, so they call it TTIP. They dropped the word FTA. And similarly, instead of calling it a negotiation with East Asia, the Trans-Pacific Free Trade Agreement, they call it TPP. So they dropped the words FTA. And by contrast, in East Asia, which used to have only 3 free trade agreements, now has almost 50 free trade agreements. That's a sign of the times that we live in, that in East Asia, there's greater belief in the power of free trade agreements and free market economics. So that's the first pillar. The second pillar, of course, quite obviously, is also mastery of science and technology. And here again, a remarkable shift has taken place that few have noticed. And as you know, the reason why the West could go out and conquer and colonize and dominate the whole world was because they had superior science and technology. And when I look back at history, I find it amazing that a small country like Portugal, with 4 million people, could colonize South America, and you have Brazil, colonize Africa, so you have Angola and Mozambique. And this small country, Portugal, could take a bite of India in Goa and take a bite of China in Macau. That's shocking. A country of 4 million people could seize territories all over the world. Why? Superior science and technology. But today, if you want to look at all the indicators, this mastery of science and technology is also shifting to Asia. Again, if you want empirical proof, just look at R&D budgets. And already East Asia is spending more in R&D in science and technology than either Europe or North America. And as you look down the road over the next 10 years, the budgets in Europe are being squeezed. The budgets in America are being squeezed. Because as you know, they have huge budgetary problems, and the budgets in East Asia are expanding. And if you want a simple indicator, from the year 1991 to 2011, in the 20-year period, United States doubled its R&D budget in 20 years. China increased its R&D budget by 20 times. That's the difference in pace. That's why you have this amazing situation today where in a region, in an area where America was dominant for so long in outer space, right? Americans were the first to send a man to the moon. They had the most exciting space exploration program. Today, Americans don't even have a vehicle to send their astronauts to outer space. They have to use Russian rockets. And now that they fought with Russia over Ukraine, they're going to have a very hard time sending astronauts into space. And by contrast, as you know, I was in China when the first Chinese astronaut walked into space. You saw this amazing excitement in China. So that's an indication of a changing world that we live in. And I should, since I speak of outer space, I tell you the most amazing thing was India's achievement in sending this space vehicle to Mars at a price per kilometer that is less than the rickshaw ride in New Delhi. That's an amazing scientific achievement by India in its voyage to Mars. But that's what's happening in Asia. And the third pillar of Western wisdom I describe as pragmatism. Pragmatism is a Western virtue, but the best definition of pragmatism was given by the Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping when he said, "It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or a cat is white. If it catches mice, it is a good cat." And that was a brilliant way of saying, it doesn't matter whether it is communism or whether it is capitalism. Whatever works, we will use it. And so he said, okay, capitalism works, we will use capitalism. But Deng Xiaoping was not the first Asian pragmatist. The first Asian pragmatists were the Japanese, who way back in the 1860s, 150 years ago, when they saw how India, a country of 300 million people, had been effortlessly colonized by 100,000 Englishmen. And when they saw how China, this huge country that they looked up to, had been humiliated in the Opium War of 1842, and the Japanese said, we will be the next to be humiliated. So the Japanese switched. They had the Meiji Reformation. They recruited the young people, and these young Meiji reformers went around the world to learn best practices. So the Japanese learned from the Americans free market economics. They learned from the French the Napoleonic Code. They learned from the Germans how to build an army. They learned from the British how to build a navy. And Japan emerged as the first modern industrial power. Excuse me. So essentially, what the Japanese did with the Meiji Reformation in the 1860s to go out and learn from the rest of the world is what the Asian countries are doing now. And one of the things that many people are not aware of is that the biggest thing that is happening in Asia is completely invisible, because I call it the great silent learning journey. Each year, thousands of Asians are traveling around the world to learn best practices and bring them home to implement it. And that's why Asia is being transformed. And we know it well in Singapore, because we get thousands of delegations coming to Singapore to learn how we build the world's best airport, how we build the world's best port. And so we know this silent learning journey is happening all this time. Now, the fourth pillar of Western wisdom I describe as meritocracy. Now, meritocracy, as you know, is all about how you select the best people to run your society. And in some ways, all those of you who participate in these leadership programs here at the Royal Institute are all beneficiaries of a process of meritocratic selection. Now, that's essentially what is happening all throughout Asia. Because I always say that if you want the simplest explanation of why Asia is doing well, it's actually very simple. Asia always had the world's largest pool of brains. Right? We have 55% of the world's population. So naturally we have the world's largest pool of brains. But Asia also had the world's largest pool of unused brains. Now the unused brains are being used on a massive scale. And fortunately, some of Asian leaders recognized the wisdom of this early on. I remember a long time ago in the 1980s, the former Prime Minister of India, Rajiv Gandhi, was asked this question, aren't you worried about a brain drain from India? You know, Indians were leaving India to go to America, to Europe. And Rajiv Gandhi gave a very wise reply. He said, better a brain drain than a brain in the drain. And that was very wise, because you can see the results 30 years later. Because if you go to America, which is the most competitive human laboratory in the world, the best and brightest from all over the world, from South America, from Europe, from Asia, from Africa, go to America to compete. And in the most competitive human laboratory on our planet, you would have thought that the most successful ethnic group may be the Japanese or the Jews or the Chinese or the Koreans. No. The most successful ethnic group in the United States of America by far, and their per capita income is higher than any other ethnic group, are the ethnic Indians from India in America. And in an essay that I wrote for McKinsey, they came out with a book called Reimagining India. I said that if Indians in India could achieve half the per capita income of Indians in America, India's GNP would not be $2 trillion. India's GNP would be $25 trillion. So you can see the incredible potential of an economy like India's in the world. And it's coming because you can see how talented Indians have done so well all over the world. So that's the potential for Asia. So let me run through very quickly the three other pillars, because I want to talk about challenges also. The three other pillars are, the fifth is of course the culture of peace, and it's very important to have peace. And I can tell you that the biggest obstacle to economic development is always war. And amazingly enough, in a region in East Asia which has seen the three biggest wars since World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Sino-Vietnamese War, the guns are silent in East Asia. Now that's a remarkable achievement for a very difficult region. And I can tell you, hopefully during Q&A, if you want me to speak more about Southeast Asia, I actually think that what ASEAN has done in Southeast Asia is a miracle. And the reason why it is a miracle is because the most diverse region on our planet by far is Southeast Asia. That's why British historians call Southeast Asia the Balkans of Asia. And guess what? The Balkans of Asia are at peace today because of ASEAN. And we can discuss that a bit more. But that's the culture of peace, which is critical. The sixth pillar of Western wisdom is the rule of law. And here, let me be honest, just as in the culture of peace, we have made progress, but we still have a long way to go. In the same way, we have made progress on the rule of law, but we still have a long way to go. And even in China, for example, even though I can tell you one statistic, that the country that has produced the largest number of new lawyers in the world is China. They have produced a few 100,000 lawyers in the last 2 decades, but they still have a long way to go in achieving the rule of law of the kind that you find in, say, Western societies. So there's some progress to be made there. And the final pillar of Western wisdom, of course, is education. And here something absolutely remarkable has happened in the field of education. Because, you know, if you look at Western education, it was clearly designed for the Western mind, right? Western education was designed for the Western mind. But amazingly, when you take a Western education and you combine it with the Asian mind does amazingly well with Western education. And if you want proof of this, just go to the graduation ceremony. You know, when my son graduated from Carnegie Mellon, I was there, a good university. And when the names of the PhD holders in science and engineering come on the stage, and Tom Friedman wrote a column about this, he saw something similar at the Rensselaer Institute of Technology. Tom said, whereas the PhD graduates came to the stage, the names began with Tan, Lee, Wang, or Kumar, Kapoor, Rakesh. He said, finally, one David Morrow saved the day. One Anglo-Saxon name walked up on the stage to get a PhD in science and engineering. And that's a postcard from the future. That's the future talent of the world. And you can see how well Asians are doing in Western education. But of course, while each of these pillars are important, actually what's remarkable is that the application of these 7 pillars and the success in the application of these 7 pillars has led to a fundamental transformation of Asia, which is also silent and invisible. And that silent, invisible transformation of Asia is what I call the explosion of cultural confidence in Asia. So today, if you want to meet the most optimistic young people in the world, don't go to Europe. If you have 50% youth unemployment in France and in Italy and Spain, the youth in Europe don't feel optimistic about the future. Even in America, which has always been the land of optimism, the young feel troubled about the future. By contrast, if you want to meet the most optimistic young people, you come to Asia, because they believe that tomorrow belongs to them. And that's why this return of Asia is irreversible and unstoppable. But, there's always a but. There will be challenges. And this brings me to my second part of my remarks about the challenges that we in Asia will face. And I will put the challenges into 3 categories, and they all begin with the word G, with the letter G. The first G challenge is geopolitics. The second G challenge is good governance. And the third G challenge is global governance. These are the 3 challenges that the Asian states will face. So the first one, geopolitics. You know, geopolitics has been around for 2,000 years or more. And geopolitics will be around for another 2,000 years or so. And we live in one of the most fascinating times of human history in geopolitical terms. And I can tell you, for 2,000 years of human history, the most important geopolitical fault line is always that between the world's largest power and the world's largest emerging power. Today, the world's largest power is the United States of America. The world's largest emerging power is China. And it is always at the point when the number 2 is about to pass number 1 to become number 1, that's when you see a rising level of tension between number 1 and number 2. And so at this point in history, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, that this is about the time when China's GNP is going to become bigger than America, we should be seeing rising levels of tension between US and China. But amazingly, we don't. This is actually quite stunning. This is a geopolitical freak. And I give credit to both Beijing and Washington, D.C. for having managed this relationship very well. And so overall, it's a relatively stable relationship. But cracks are appearing. Now, you saw a sign of this just a few weeks ago. As you know, China announced a proposal for the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And it's a good proposal because, all of us in Asia, we need more infrastructure. We need an infrastructure bank. We should have all supported China. Instead, as you know, United States campaigned very hard. And when Xi Jinping launched the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in Beijing a few weeks ago, South Korea didn't turn up, Japan didn't turn up, Australia didn't turn up partly because of pressure from the United States of America. So that's an example of geopolitical competition. So I can tell you, I'm reasonably certain that if you follow the normal logic of history, there will be rising geopolitical competition between US and China. It's coming. And I can tell you that we in Singapore are very worried about this because Singapore, as a small state, will be directly affected by US-China geopolitical competition. Because we, Singapore, as a small state, we have a very good defense relationship with the United States of America, and we want to maintain this good defense relationship because it's been good for us. But if tensions rise between US and China, and 75% of Singapore's population is Chinese, we have to be very careful. We cannot be caught within rivalry between China and the US. So we as a small state have to be very, very careful. But I can tell you that while today's geopolitical challenge is between United States and China, tomorrow's geopolitical challenge will be between the two rising powers in 20, 30 years from now, and that will be between China and India. That too is coming. And I would say, if I lived in Bhutan, I would pay very, very careful attention to this geopolitical competition between China and India. And I can tell you, we at the Lee Kuan Yew School, we think that that's going to be a big challenge. So we have invested $8 million. We have set up an $8 million endowment fund to study the future of China-India relations. And I want to let you know that we'll be happy to share all these studies with you so that you can use them also in trying to understand this relationship. We'll be happy to do so, to share this with you. But these are the geopolitical challenges that are coming. Now, I haven't spoken about another geopolitical challenge, China and Japan. We can talk about that in Q&A when we come to that. So that's the first G challenge. The second G challenge is good governance. And it's very clear that while the Asian countries have succeeded in many ways with their economic development, their political development has often not kept pace with their economic development. And as a result of that, they are struggling. Now, if you want an example, the best example I can give you is Thailand in Southeast Asia. Now, for a long time, Thailand was the most stable state in Southeast Asia. Indeed, the only state out of the 10 states in Southeast Asia, the only one out of the 10 that was not colonized by any Western power was Thailand. Because the Thais were geopolitically deft and shrewd in the way they handled the colonial powers, and they avoided colonization. And they've always had strong institutions, they had a strong monarchy, and everyone thought, hey, Thailand is safe. And I can tell you, as a political analyst, which is what my job description is, I was personally shocked at how divided Thailand has become. Between, as you know, the red shirts who support the former Prime Minister Thaksin and the yellow shirts who support the establishment in Bangkok. I go to Bangkok frequently. I'm writing a book on Southeast Asia with my fellow author in Bangkok. And every time I go to Bangkok, I'm surprised at how divided the country is. So that's an example of a good governance challenge that can arise. And the third G, of course, is global governance. And here it's very obvious that, one of the biggest gifts that the West gave to humanity was this whole family of multilateral institutions, many of them based in the UN and some related to the UN, like IMF and the World Bank. Now, these are good institutions, but the West wants to continue to dominate them. And that's no longer tenable because, at a time when the Asian share of the global GNP is becoming bigger and bigger and bigger, you cannot have a rule that says that to become the head of the IMF, you must be European. To become the head of the World Bank, you must be an American. Unfortunately, that is still the rule. And so that all these rules have to change to adapt to the new world order. So this is the global governance challenge that we have to deal with. Now, so all this brings me to my conclusion, which is, what are the prospects for Asia? And the reason I began with a story about the two narratives of the priests is that as you look ahead to Asia's prospects, you will see two different narratives. If you read the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times and the Economist, you would be excused for believing that China is about to break apart and fall apart any day now. Because the Western narrative is that the Chinese cannot continue succeeding in the way that they have, that the Communist Party will collapse and fail. I disagree completely with that analysis. So I have a very different narrative. So I have a much more optimistic narrative for Asia. Again, you see, I like the number 3 for 3 reasons why I'm optimistic. The first reason why I'm optimistic is that by an amazing coincidence of history, future historians, when they look back at the year 2014, our year now, they'll be absolutely shocked. He said, how did it end up that the 3 most populous states in Asia, China, India, and Indonesia, how did all 3 simultaneously have strong, dynamic, reform-minded leaders? I can tell you that President Xi Jinping is an amazing leader. He is determined to transform China. And he'll probably go down in history as the 3rd most important leader of modern China after Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping. He is determined to lift China up to a new height. And as you know, strong leadership makes a huge difference to a country. And in the case of India, I think you all probably know India better than I do. It is amazing that Prime Minister Modi was elected with such an incredible mandate. I went to call on him 3 years ago because I'm chairman of the Lee Kuan Yew World City Prize nominating committee, and we had nominated Ahmedabad to be on the short list for the Lee Kuan Yew World City Prize. So I went to Ahmedabad, I spent 2 hours talking to then Chief Minister Modi, and I was very impressed by him. Because this is a can-do leader, hands-on leader who believes in results. And that's why, as you know, when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat, Gujarat was growing at 10 to 12% a year. So he, I believe, will implement significant reforms. So India will also take off. And finally, Indonesia, a country of 270 million people, has elected someone called Jokowi, as it is popularly known. And I was invited to spend 7 hours with him on December 18 last year. We drove around the car together. He showed me his projects and we had a long conversation. And I was very impressed by him. Just give you one small example. There was a highway across Jakarta that had been 90% completed in 1998. And then President Suharto fell in 1998 and the highway stopped. For 16 years, nobody could complete the construction of the highway. Governor Jokowi came along, he finished the job. He is also like Prime Minister Modi, a can-do man who will transform Indonesia. So this is amazing. For Asia to have 3 of the best leaders in office at the same time must mean that the economic development of Asia is going to get a boost in the next 10 years. So that's one reason why I'm optimistic. The second reason why I'm optimistic is that after all these years of development, the size of the middle classes in Asia have grown. Now, I've given you a few statistics. You may forget some of them, I'm sure. But if you want to leave this room with just one statistic, take away this statistic because it's the most transformative statistic of all. And what is that? It is that in the year 2010, in all of Asia, from West Asia to East Asia, the total size of the Asian middle class was 500 million people. That's a reasonable size, 500 million people. About the population of size of the population of Europe. But by 2020, which is only 6 years from now, that number is going to explode from 500 million to 1.75 billion. An increase of 3.5 times in 10 years. The world has seen nothing like this ever in human history. And if you want the global figures for global middle class, in 2010 it was 1.8 billion. In 2020 it will be 3.2 billion. And by 2030, it will be 4.9 billion, which means by 2030, more than half the world's population will be enjoying middle-class living standards. And that's why I wrote the book, The Great Convergence, my latest book, to describe this great transformation that we are seeing in the world. And that's why I'm very optimistic also for the future. But finally, the final reason why I'm optimistic for the future, and then I'll stop and take questions from all of you, is that I believe that after every economic renaissance And what we have seen in Asia, by the way, in the last 20 or 30 years, we in Asia have seen one of the biggest economic renaissance ever seen in human history. But an economic renaissance will soon be followed by a cultural renaissance. And I predict that the next 10 to 20 years will be some of the best years to be living in Asia, because you will see these remarkable cultural renaissances happening all over in China, India, and Indonesia, Vietnam, and many other countries. So that cultural renaissance in turn will provide a boost to growth, because it will make people feel more confident about the future. So if I'm to summarize my talk in one line, I would say the good times are coming. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, for sharing with us your most incisive insights on which you base your most riveting Asian narrative. I would now like to open the floor to the audience for questions. Please come to the mic, which are there in the passage. We also have mics I think we have one mic in the front, and we have two in the passages. Any questions? Yes. Yes, please.
Good evening, Professor. Thank you very much for the enlightening talk. But the caption up there, it says Asia in today's world. And I'm afraid that I have to tell you that we are too small in Asia and much smaller in the world from all angles. So when the Asia is going to have good time, what would be the pluses and minuses for a small economy and a country along with a small population like ours? If you could give us your take on this. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very, very good question. I would say that there are both opportunities for Bhutan and there are dangers for Bhutan. And by the way, I don't just mean Bhutan. I would say there are opportunities for any small state and dangers for any small state. So even Singapore, there are opportunities for Singapore and dangers for Singapore. And let me talk about the dangers first, okay? Throughout history, as you know, when geopolitical changes happen, it is the small states that often suffer. This is a given of human history. And indeed, and the changes don't have to be negative. You know, there's a very wise Sri Lankan proverb which says, when elephants fight, the grass suffers, but when elephants make love, the grass also suffers. So it doesn't matter. So when the elephants start dancing, we small states have to be careful. And we are now moving in global strategic terms from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. So instead of having one big elephant in the room, which posed its own challenges, which was the United States at the end of the Cold War, we're moving to a multipolar world. So there'll be United States, there'll be China, there'll be Russia, there'll be Europe, there'll be Japan, there'll be India. It's a much more complex world. And if you want an example of what not to do, go and study Ukraine. That country suffered because it didn't understand that it was caught between two powers, Russia and United States. Instead of being very careful and neutral, it tried to lean to one side or the other, and it suffered. So the lesson for small states is, when geopolitical changes happen, be very, very careful. These are moments of great danger for small states. And from Singapore's point of view, I was very honest, and I said that if relations between US and China get difficult, Singapore will have a very difficult time. So we have to be very careful. And not just Singapore, any other state. You name me a state, I would say I can point out to you the geopolitical challenges that that state will face. But at the same time, on balance, as you can see, I'm optimistic that the tendency towards peace and cooperation will be stronger than the tendency towards war and conflict. Now, I have to emphasize, you must put aside the Middle East. There is a dysfunctional part of the world which is called the Middle East. There's Iraq, there's Syria, there's Israel-Palestine, there's Libya. Now that part of the world has not fixed itself yet. Push aside the Middle East. But if you look at most of Africa, if you look at most of Latin America, if you look at most of Asia, most of the countries are growing and doing well. In fact, from the point of view of the 7 billion people on our planet, most of them today are much better off than they were 20 or 30 years ago. So I sometimes compare these changes to large waves that are coming. So a small state like Bhutan and a small state like Singapore must learn to become like surfers. Surfers in California, you must catch the wave and go with the wave. Because there'll be new waves of changes coming. Try to stay on top of the waves as they come. So on balance, I say there are more opportunities than dangers, but always remember the dangers. They're always there. Yes, please. Yeah.
Professor, I would like to actually ask a small question in relation to global governance. I know you often use the boat metaphor in trying to explain how this world is sailing without a captain, and you often say that this boat consists of 193 cabins protected by different captains and crews. But my question is, there is a global trend where there is a global trend of growing regionalism, regional boundary, meaning all those 93 cabins are being now divided slowly because of the geopolitical and economic reasons. So in these terms, I would like to ask, how do you view this growing regionalism in relation to the global governance? Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, thank you. That's, I must say, a very good question. Thank you for asking it. He's referring to the boat metaphor. Let me tell you a little bit about the boat metaphor. because it is the central metaphor I use in my latest book called The Great Convergence. And in that, I say that this is how the boat metaphor works. In the past, when 7 billion people lived in 193 separate countries, it was as though they were living in 193 separate boats with captains and crews taking care of each boat and rules to make sure that the boats didn't collide. And that, I would say, is a good description of the post-World War II world order. But today, as a result of the world having shrunk and having become small and interdependent, the 7 billion people in the world no longer live in 193 separate boats. The 7 billion people in the world live in 193 separate cabins on the same boat. But the problem with our global boat is that you have captains and crews taking care of each cabin and no captain or crew taking care of the global boat as a whole. And that explains why we have so many global challenges. That explains why we have global financial crisis. That explains why we have global warming. That explains why we have global pandemics like Ebola, because nobody's taking care of the boat as a whole. They're only taking care of our cabins. So that I see as a central challenge of our time. But you made a very important point also, that while people are not moving towards global governance, they are strengthening regional institutions, and I agree. And I think it's actually very good that regional institutions are being strengthened. I mentioned in my remarks, for example, that the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, is clearly by far the second most successful example of regional cooperation after the European Union. And this is amazing. So ASEAN has brought peace to one of the most difficult and troubled regions on our planet. And indeed, I think, frankly, if I be very frank with you, I think SAARC, South Asian Association of Regional Cooperation, should learn some lessons from ASEAN. Because ASEAN is so far ahead of SAARC in terms of its regional cooperation. Indeed, next year in 2015, ASEAN, for example, will be announcing an ASEAN economic community where there will be practically zero tariffs between the 10 member states of ASEAN, and there will be all kinds of removal of regulations that have hindered trade between the 10 ASEAN countries. So stronger regional cooperation is a good thing, but of course some regions are doing well and some regions are doing bad. I mean, if you take, for example, the Middle East, even if you take a small group like the Gulf Cooperation Council, the Gulf Cooperation Council, as you know, has got Saudi Arabia, Oman, UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain. These are all small states. And if I belong to the GCC as a group of small states, I want to make the GCC as strong as possible because it will protect me as a small state. But these small states are fighting each other. So the GCC is divided. So, for example, when you have a problem in Egypt, right? One side was supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, like Qatar, and Saudi Arabia was supporting the military, and the GCC was divided. Now that's not very good. If you are a group of small states, you must always learn to collaborate and cooperate with each other, because if you are divided, you are endangering yourselves. So small states should therefore encourage stronger regional cooperation, and I'm glad that that question was posed. I want to say that I hope somebody will challenge me and say, you know, Professor, you're all wrong. Please say that.
Professor, I'm Karma Chodin, a participant of Self-3 here at RICS. It's a great privilege to let you know that the moment I reported here at RICS, I got hold of your book, The Great Convergence. I couldn't wait to read the book so to get a feel of what your talk would be like today. I haven't yet finished the book, but from the reviews that the scholars and great minds have done, it sounds like you have thrown yet another insight into Asia's role in the global economy. In the light of this book, Professor, I would like to ask you, how do you see Bhutan playing its role in the global economy? Thank you.
Thank you. Again, a very good question. I think it's very important for the small states to understand that the United Nations is a gift to the small states of the world. You know? And indeed, this was confirmed by a... Excuse me. One day I went to a conference in America. And it was, I think, the Association of Professional Schools of International Affairs. And we were traveling in a bus together. And as I was sitting in the bus, on my left was a man called Robert Hutchings, a former head of the United States National Intelligence Council. And he was very honest with me, and I appreciated his honesty. He said to me, Kishore, I can understand why you as Singapore want to strengthen the United Nations, because for a small state, a strong United Nations makes you more secure and enhances your capacity to influence the world. But he says, from the United States point of view, a strong United Nations is a constraint on American power. So that's why we don't want to see a strong United Nations. And that, by the way, has been American policy. But they've never said so. Until John Bolton came along, the former United States ambassador to the UN, and in his memoirs, you can read, he describes openly a conversation he had with Condoleezza Rice, and he said he and Condi Rice discussed whether the United States should support a strong United Nations Secretary General, and Condi Rice and John Bolton agreed, no, we don't want a strong UN Secretary General. We want a weak UN Secretary General. Now, so we as the small states, our interests are different from the great powers in the United Nations. That's why, as you know, Singapore has launched something called the Forum of Small States Force in the UN, and Bhutan is a member. When I was ambassador to the UN, I used to work closely with my Bhutanese counterparts. We as small states must work harder, much harder, to make institutions like the United Nations stronger. And I see a window of opportunity coming. And you know, if you read my book, The Great Convergence, I begin the book by quoting from a speech that President Bill Clinton gave in Yale in 2003. And in that speech, Bill Clinton said, very openly, very honestly, he said, if America assumes it's going to be number one forever, then fine. We should keep on doing what we are doing. We can be unilateral. It doesn't matter. But then Bill Clinton added a but. He said, but if we can imagine a world where America is no longer number one, then surely it is in America's interest to strengthen a rules-based order and to strengthen international institutions. So if you go to my website, www.mahbubani.net, you'll find I have written so many articles calling on America saying, hey, when you were number one, it was in your interest to weaken international institutions, but you're going to become number two. And when you're number two, it is now in your interest to strengthen international institutions. So far, I can tell you, Last week I was in Washington, D.C. I've had an amazing week. Last week I was addressing people in the Policy Planning Directorate of the United States State Department, trying to persuade Americans to change their attitude towards the United Nations. And I'll be very candid with you, I failed. I didn't succeed at all. But I'll keep trying. But it'll be hard to persuade the United States, but I think small states like Bhutan and Singapore should work even harder to strengthen organizations like the United Nations. Yes, please.
Good evening, Professor. My name is Sonam Singh. I work in the Ministry of Economic Affairs. Firstly, thank you very much for a most thought-provoking and stimulating lecture that you have given. It's just something that I had been thinking for quite some time, and in many ways, in the challenges and prospects that you talked about, it confirmed some of my own thoughts. And that was, I remember somebody asked me a few years ago, can you tell me the 3 things that you think are of major concern for this world? And my answer at that time was that global terrorism, climate change, and population growth. I said these are 3 things, in my opinion, that we as global citizens need to be concerned about. And when I listen to your challenges and the prospects, in some ways it confirms this thought of mine. But what I wanted to ask you basically was that you've talked about the prospects of Asia. A few days back I had the opportunity to read the Asian Outlook, Energy Outlook book of 2013, produced by the Asian Development Bank. And in that report they say that by the year 2035, Asia's contribution to world GDP will be about 50%. Unfortunately, this contribution will mainly be driven by consumption of fossil fuel. And definitely this is an issue of concern if the type of growth that we are looking at is likely to happen. There's also the environmental issues that we need to be concerned about. So perhaps if you could share your thoughts on how this growth of Asia is going to take place and what would be the implication on some of these global concerns. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That must say that's a wonderful question, because that's one dimension I haven't addressed at all about the environmental sustainability of Asia's growth. And that's a huge challenge. And indeed, I now believe that we in Asia should try to be smarter than the West in the Western Industrial Revolution. And as you know, in the West, when the West undertook its Industrial Revolution, London was a city full of peat and smoke and everything, because they just built factories, the factories threw out soot, and nobody gave a damn because that was progress. We should learn a lesson from that, and we should now go for environmentally sustainable growth. But our challenge is that, and it was actually Prime Minister Manmohan Singh who put it very well when he went to Copenhagen. He said, yes, I want to prevent global warming, but don't ask me to deprive 300 million Indians of electricity from coal-fired plants because of global warming, because you in the West, when you grew and developed, you didn't take care of the global environment. So you have to do something first. As you know, that was what the debate in Copenhagen was all about. Now, fortunately for us, our biggest ally today is technology. Technology will enable us to grow in an environmentally sustainable way. Let me give you one statistic. I don't know whether it is still true, but it was true 3 to 4 years ago. For every additional unit of GNP that China adds, and for the same additional unit of GNP that Japan adds, China uses 10 times the energy of Japan. The Japanese are technologically amazing. They have some of the most energy efficient industries. And so we in Asia, for example, should learn from Japan how the Japanese became so technologically so efficient in their use of energy. So you are right, we will still have to rely on fossil fuels, we will still have to rely on coal for a while, but we have to keep switching away from them. And I can tell you that one of the most momentous global decisions was made by China just a few years ago. As you know, in Copenhagen, there was a big debate between the West and the developing countries, and China and India stood side by side and said, hey, you in the West, you grew and developed, you industrialized without taking care of the environment. It is your responsibility to take care of the environment, not our responsibility. That was the debate in Copenhagen. Now, something happened in China 3 to 4 years ago. The Chinese government did its own calculations of global warming. And then the Chinese government realized that if you had global warming, China would be one of the countries to suffer the most. So the Chinese made a major policy switch away from denying climate change to embracing climate change. But the Chinese did it so quietly, nobody noticed it. And indeed, the person who told me about this big shift was the former environment minister from India, Jairam Ramesh, who's a friend of mine. So Jairam and I had tea in Singapore, and he says, Kishore, the Chinese have changed 180 degrees. And that's why if you look at the Chinese plans today, while they continue to increase their energy supplies, as you know, they're trying to reduce their energy intensity as much as possible. So that's what we have to do. And by the way, Bhutan is doing the world a huge service by providing hydropower. Your hydropower is making the global atmosphere much, much cleaner. And I wish you that you provide more hydropower. I only wish that Singapore was close to Bhutan, because we would love to get hydropower from you too. Yeah. Yes, please. Go ahead. 1, 2.
Thank you, Professor. My name is Karmagile. I'm a participant at RICS for the Executive Leadership Program here. I would like to refer to Professor's remarks with regard to the impending geopolitical tension between the future two superpowers, India and China. And you also mentioned, forewarned about the potential dangers for Bhutan as a small country wedged between these two countries. So I would like to know if you could elaborate what are the dangers that Bhutan is going to face because of this tension, and what are the strategies that Bhutan should be prepared to handle those, particularly with your experience from Singapore of handling the current geopolitical tension between US and China. Thank you.
I think I will say this is the most difficult question I've been asked. I think if I answer the question honestly, I may get in trouble. I think, frankly, it is, you see, as you know, you have a border with China. You have a border with India. And if you have a border with two countries, and the two countries begin to have conflict and rivalry, you will be squeezed. I'm being very honest with you. This happens to all small states. So it is actually in Bhutan's national interests to see good relations between China and India. And as you know, I mean, we can have a 1-hour discussion on the state of Sino-Indian relations. Overall, I would say they're generally okay, but there are lots of points of tension in the China-India relationship. And I would say, as a small state, it's important for Bhutan to send the signal that you're not taking sides. So Singapore makes it very clear that if you have a problem between the United States and China, we do not take sides. We are not pro-American, we are not pro-Chinese, we are pro-Singapore. So in Bhutan, I would say you are not pro-Indian, you're not pro-China, you're pro-Bhutan. So that's a very important position for small states to take, because that's a very difficult and delicate thing that you have to. Now, I'm aware, by the way, I'm aware that you have a very special, close relationship with India. I know that. And I'm aware that this has been working very well for Bhutan. I also know that when I serve on the Global Advisory Council of the Prime Minister of India with Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, he spoke very fondly of Bhutan. Prime Minister Manmohan Singh was one of your greatest fans of Bhutan. So it's good that you have this special relationship with India, and you must maintain this special relationship with India. But at the same time, if difficulties arise, you must be very careful. Very, very careful. So that's my only point to you. So small states can never change the larger geopolitical picture. We just have to learn to be careful. We must know when to move, when to step aside, and to be very careful and very deft, and be very nimble. Because if you're not, then and a state like Ukraine, for example, I gave the Ukraine example, I can give you the Georgia example. States which do not play the game well, they suffer. The big powers will not suffer. No. But the small states will suffer. So it's important for small states to be very, very nimble. And that's why I said we'll be very happy to share with you the research we are doing on China and India, because frankly, it is more meaningful, much more meaningful for you than it is for us in some ways, this relationship that is going to happen within the two. There's another question here. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. I'm Tashi, one of the humble participants of Circ 3. Ultimately, I found that there is no need for us to rejoice for China overtaking the United States. Linking to the earlier question, now with India and China being the member of BRICS, which in fact expands over 3 continents, occupying about 40% of all population. So is the situation going to become worse for the smaller countries?
Because of BRICS, B-R-I-C-S,
yes,
BRICS.
Yes.
Yeah. No, I would say, no, actually, I take a very optimistic view of multilateral cooperation. You know, many people say that there are too many organizations. You know, you have the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, you have the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, you have BRICS, you have SARC, you have so many things. It is actually very good for the world. It is good for the world and good for small states to have more and more forms of cooperation between states. Because one of the points I make in my writings is that international organizations and regional organizations have a civilizing effect on the behavior of states. And Exhibit A is ASEAN in Southeast Asia. You know, when I grew up as a child in Singapore, and when Singapore was expelled from Malaysia in 1965, we in Singapore worried about having to go to war with Malaysia and possibly, maybe eventually Indonesia. We used to worry about it. Now, we don't worry about it. Why not? because ASEAN has civilized the nations of Southeast Asia. And I can tell you, because I was in the Foreign Service for 33 years, and I must have attended several hundred ASEAN meetings. When you go to these meetings, there is something called peer pressure. So as a result of peer pressure, if somebody's being very unreasonable, everybody looks at him and say, "What's wrong with you? Why are you behaving like this?" Right? The peer pressure has a psychological effect on people's behavior. So the fact that there's BRICS, and even if BRICS does nothing except to improve relations between China and India, BRICS is a good thing. So the more of such organizations that we have, the better off the world is. And Singapore, by the way, believes in joining as many organizations as possible. I never thought that the day would come when I would see that Singapore, which is on the equator, is now a member of the Arctic Council. Isn't that amazing? That's because we are afraid global warming will mean that ships will go across the Arctic and not come to Singapore. That's why we joined the Arctic Council. But it's good for more states to join more regional and international organizations, and we as small states should welcome it as much as possible.
Professor, if I may take a cue from your opening remarks and say, I'm sorry to be a spoilsport, but I believe we have a question from the balcony. Could we have the question?
Yes, Professor, thank you very much for that very, very enlightening talk. You mentioned the challenges as 3Gs. Could I put an R to add to those? It may be a mouse in a drawing room, or it might be an elephant. I don't really know. But suffice to say, if one looks at the Industrial Revolution in the West, which was perhaps the moment when the West came to prominence, R, namely religion, played quite a large part in that. Protestantism and the rise of capitalism went hand in hand. So I'd like to ask whether a challenge for Asia in the broad sense lies possibly in religion as well as the 3Gs.
Well, that definitely qualifies for a very difficult question. No, the question of religion is a very complex story, and I would do great injustice to give you a very simple answer. But I would say it varies from region to region and not necessarily religion to religion. Let me give you a simple example. As you know, I think you mentioned earlier on, you worry about global terrorism. And most people, when they talk of global terrorism, I mean, even though terrorist acts have been carried out by Buddhists, by Christians, by Muslims, most of the time when we talk of global terrorism today, we are worried about organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIL and so on and so forth. So we do fear that Islam as a religion could be a violent religion. But if you look at the record, there are, in Southeast Asia, there are close to 250 million Muslims, but the 250 million Muslims in Southeast Asia have been able to live in peace with 100 million Christians in Southeast Asia, have been able to live in peace with 150 million Buddhists in Southeast Asia, have been able to live in peace with the Taoists, Confucianists, Hindus in Southeast Asia. So it is not religion per se, it's actually you have to look at the region also and see what it's like. And I would say that by and large, the tendency in Asia, by and large, is towards moving towards greater secularism. Okay, I mean, take China for example. the Chinese wear their this is a very dangerous thing to say, by the way, you know. I may get in trouble for saying this, but I'll say it anyway, you know, since I'm among friends. The Chinese wear their religion very lightly. You know, they're not that concerned about their religion. They're religious. They'll go to temples, they go and pray, and so on and so forth. But the Chinese don't go to war over religion, you know. It's not in their nature to do so. And I would say even though in India too, you know, you can have a debate about that, I would say the secular tradition in India still remains relatively strong. Even though there are challenges to the secular order, but the secular order remains in place. So if you leave aside the Middle East, and I keep emphasizing that the Middle East is a dysfunctional part of the world, and I say this, I'm a friend of the Middle East. I want them to wake up and fix that region because it's a dysfunctional part of the world. If you exclude the dysfunctional Middle East from the rest of the world, I don't see many religious clashes emerging. Now, of course, there'll be specific incidents, okay? Now, there'll be the problem about the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. But that's a leftover problem from the past that hasn't been fixed yet. But it can be fixed. It can be done. And you've had many cases where you've had religious differences in the past, and people have overcome them and have learned to live together peacefully. So I don't see religion as the thing. If you ask me what keeps me awake at night when I worry about the future of Asia, the R word does not figure in keeping me awake.
Thank you, Professor. My name is Tashi, and I work as Member of Parliament. I read your book, The New Asian Hemisphere, many years ago. In that you mentioned that you cannot predict the future exactly, but you can study the trend, analyze the way it's going, and make some kind of prognosis. And I think over the many decades you've been writing, you have made certain prognosis, like you did today on the future of China and India. Over the many years, has there been any prognosis or an analysis you've made that has been proven wrong by events? Thank you.
No, this is a very difficult question. Because if I say to him, I have never been proven wrong, I will come across as being very arrogant. But I would say, I'll just be very honest with you. Recently, a friend of mine sent me an article which I published in the International Herald Tribune, before it was called International New York Times, 21 years ago in 1993. And if you read what I wrote in 1993, is actually a very good description of 2014. So many of the trends that I've been speaking about the return of Asia, about the success of the Asian states, about the success of ASEAN and all these things, so far, touch wood, most of my predictions have come true. I mean, there may be specific things that I may not have got absolutely right. I'll give you an example. In 1986, at the height of the Cold War, when Vietnam was siding with the Soviet Union and when Philippines was siding with America, in 86, that's roughly now 28 years ago, I gave a speech at the Council on Foreign Relations saying why the US naval base will eventually move from Subic Bay to Cam Ranh Bay in Vietnam. Now, it hasn't happened yet, but my prediction that Vietnam would move away from Soviet Union to moving closer to the United States has happened. And I don't know whether you noticed this, there's a love affair going on between Vietnam and the United States, And I could predict it because I know for 2,000 years the Vietnamese have been worried about China. The Vietnamese have been having these disputes with China for 2,000 years. They were occupied by China for 1,000 years. So it is perfectly natural, by the laws of geopolitical logic, that Vietnam would drift towards America. And I said this when Vietnam was the #1 ally of Soviet Union in 1986. So the thing about geopolitics is that there's a certain logic to it. So you can predict what's going to happen. So for example, as China becomes stronger and stronger, I predict that many of the neighbors of China will now begin to cooperate closer with each other. So I predict that Japan and India will develop a closer partnership because both are equally worried about the rise of China. So this is perfectly natural, and you've seen it happening. And sometimes it happens out of accident. It so happens that Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Abe of Japan have good personal chemistry. Now, personal chemistry, by the way, is a remarkably important thing in international relations that people underestimate. And so that personal chemistry is also driving it, but geopolitical logic is also driving it. So this is perfectly natural. So if you try to be very rational in your analysis, and you know, one thing I learned, one of the best education I had is that Singapore was blessed with some of the greatest leaders. You know, I can tell you this. Again, I mentioned by an amazing accident of history, China, India, and Indonesia have strong leaders. Singapore, when it was born as a small, fragile state in 1965, was blessed with 3 of the best leaders in the world. Their names were Lee Kuan Yew, Goh Keng Swee, Rajaratnam. I learned from all 3 of them how to be very hard-headed and very realistic in the analysis of international affairs, because small states cannot afford to have illusions about international relations. So as a result of that training which I got, I applied that, and so far, again, touch wood, most of my predictions have come true so far. So I'll keep thinking of which one has been proven wrong, and I'll try and find one for you sometime.
Thank you. Shall we? Okay. Then that can be the very last question.
Thank you, Professor, for giving me the last opportunity. I'm Sencho, a very excited participant who have driven from Paro to be here today to attend to your talk. And equally, I was excited when you ended your talk talking on Asian optimism. However, as you were answering the queries, I was a little confused, because whether it is the Western narrative or an Asian narrative, small countries like Bhutan still have to walk the tightrope. So even in the Asian optimism, what is there for small countries like Bhutan if you still have to walk the tightrope? Secondly, in your talk, you were brushing aside Middle East, saying they are dysfunctional. I was a little worried as to how it could be, because Middle East, with their money power and the oil power, they play quite a dominant role in the economic development of the country, because every now and then when the crude oil prices rises, they jack up or they jack it down at their whims and fancies, as I see it. So how could we brush them aside? And how could we call them dysfunctional? Because I'm worried a dysfunctional group of states has an overpowering influence on the most important resources as of now. Thank you.
Yeah, two very good questions. Let me deal with the Middle East first, and then I come to your tightrope question, which is a wonderful question, by the way. On the Middle East, I used to, when I was young, when Singapore was poor, and our per capita income in 1965 was the same as Ghana. right? Singapore was a very poor country when I grew up. Now our per capita income is higher than United Kingdom. But when we were poor, I would look at the Arab countries and we would say how lucky these people are. Oil has been a blessing for them. Actually, oil has been a curse on these Middle East societies because they relied so much on oil from the ground. They forgot to develop the most important thing, which is their human capital. And I can tell you it's so tragic when you go to the Middle East. You know, Singaporeans are used to working hard all the time. The Middle East countries, the people haven't learned how to work hard. And believe me, you lose your life if you lead a lazy life and you just live on oil wealth. And I think that's also part of the reason why these Middle Eastern societies are dysfunctional, because they haven't learned how to work hard, to develop the human capital, to develop human ingenuity, to develop enterprise, to become entrepreneurs, and so on and so forth. So I don't envy these Middle Eastern countries, and I think oil is only a short-term thing. And I believe actually that we are on the verge of another major technological revolution coming, and as a result of new technologies, our reliance on oil is going to go down, and as our reliance on oil will go down, the poor Middle Eastern countries will then have to wake up and learn how to work hard again. That's going to be. So I don't envy them at all. And I think they're going to have, if they don't start now fixing their problems, they'll be in deep trouble 10 to 20 years. And so that's another prediction I'm making. You can remember that 10 to 20 years from now on the Middle East. But your question on the tightrope is fascinating, because you are right. It is an existential condition of all small states that they must always walk on a tightrope. That's the sheer result of being small. You cannot avoid it. But you can either walk on a tightrope, right, where the bottom is 1,000 feet away, or walk on a tightrope where the bottom is 10 feet away. And the rise of Asia is raising the bottom from 1,000 feet to 10 feet for small states. So we actually live in a much more congenial environment. So for example, if China and India focus on growth and prosperity, and I think they will, I predict, another prediction I'm making, that China and India will realize that their main priority today is to fix their own countries and focus on growth and prosperity. And if they focus on growth and prosperity, then Bhutan will have a more comfortable time than the opposite. So you will have to walk on the tightrope, but it will be a more congenial environment to walk in than before.
Thank you, Professor, for sharing so generously, and thank you, audience, for the wide range of questions. It's an honor and a privilege, really, to listen to you, Professor, and to be here today. I would like to invite Thong Rinzin, the project coordinator at RICS, to propose the vote of thanks.
Your Majesty the King, Prime Minister, Professor Kishore Mahbubani, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Since 1907, the kings of Bhutan have provided unprecedented leadership, bringing the country through a century of change and development. This legacy of leadership continues to bless and inspire the people and the country, and the establishment of the Royal Institute for Governance and Strategic Studies is one testimony of the great vision and foresight of His Majesty the King. On this joyous eve of the 6th coronation anniversary, we are extremely honored to have the gracious presence of His Majesty the King at the Institute for the 6th Friday Forum Lecture. These are times in the history of our Institute and our own personal lives that we can never cherish and celebrate enough. On behalf of everyone associated with the Institute, I would like to take this opportunity to express our deepest respects and gratitude to His Majesty the King for the continued royal guidance and blessings. Since the launch of RICS in October last year, one man that we were consistently after was Professor Kishore Mahbubani. The fact that it took Professor 1 year to commit us one night of his time should give all of us a sense of how busy and how much sought after he is as an intellect and a speaker. Nonetheless, we are extremely happy and privileged that Professor Mahbubani could be with us tonight to talk on a subject of which he is an undisputed champion. In his book, Can Asians Think?, Professor Mahbubani has written, and I quote, "The mental switch that is taking place in Asian minds today is that they no longer believe that the only way to progress is through copying. They now believe they can work out their own solutions." Unquote. After listening to you tonight, I wonder if there will be anyone in the audience who is not convinced that the time has come for Asians, particularly for our governments and leaders, to walk the extra miles and rise to the opportunity presented before us by time. Institutions such as the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and the Royal Institute for Governance and Strategic Studies provide the perfect forum to boost this mental switch that you have talked about in your book and to play a pivotal role in the transformation and transition of our societies to greater heights. On behalf of the Institute, its governing board, faculty, staff and course participants, and on behalf of the alumni of the LKY School of Public Policy, some of whom are here tonight, including myself, I would like to express our deepest gratitude to Professor Kishore Mahbubani for being with us tonight to deliver this thought-provoking Friday Forum lecture. We take this as a big gesture of goodwill and cooperation from you and the Lee Kuan Yew School, and we look forward to collaborating closely with you and the school as we go along. Thank you very much, Professor. I would also like to thank the RICS Governing Board, members of the RICS faculty, participants of the inaugural Military Leaders Strategic Studies Seminar and the 3rd Senior Executive Leadership Program, officers and colleagues at His Majesty's Secretariat, Chukha Dzongkhak and Phensling Tungkhak officials, Phensling Thomde officials, Royal Bhutan Police, Royal Bhutan Army, Lhaki and Druk hotels, and all other agencies and individuals who have helped us organize this event tonight. I would also like to thank my own staff here at RICS who have worked very hard, as always, in preparation for this event. Last but not the least, I would like to thank all the distinguished guests and participants for joining us today, and we look forward for your participation in the future Friday Forum lectures at RICS. Before we close, as a token of appreciation and goodwill, we would like to present to Professor a lighted butter lamp. Thank you very much, and Tashi Dile.